Chapter 5. The Truth of the Mind. The private jet ride to the world-renowned neurologist in Zurich had been tense but uneventful. Sophie had tried to keep herself composed, but as they landed, her hands trembled slightly. She glanced at Ethan, who was absorbed in a magazine about chess he had picked up at the airport. "This place looks expensive," Ethan said, glancing out the window at the pristine hospital grounds. "It is," Sophie admitted, forcing a smile. "Only the best for you." Ethan chuckled. "If I were really your boyfriend, I'd say you're spoiling me too much." Her heart clenched at the reminder of what they had lost. What he had lost. The doctor, a calm and soft-spoken man in his 60s, introduced himself as Dr. Wilhelm. He listened carefully as Sophie recounted Ethan's past, his accident, and the drastic changes in his behavior and personality. Once the detailed discussions and tests were complete, Sophie found herself sitting across from the doctor in his office, the soft hum of medical equipment filling the space. Ethan, uninterested in the specifics, had wandered off to explore the hospital's library. "Miss," Dr. Wilhelm began, his tone calm and measured, "Ethan's condition is rare. By that, I mean his amnesia seems to have caused him to revert to his original self, his unfiltered core personality. He has forgotten the persona he cultivated over the years." Sophie frowned, leaning forward in her chair. "The character he created?" The doctor nodded, consulting his notes. "Yes. Based on the information you and Ethan's family provided, the version of Ethan you described, the reserved, considerate partner, was something he consciously constructed. From what I understand, he did this to navigate social dynamics, perhaps to avoid being misunderstood or alienated. It wasn't an attempt to deceive you, but rather a way to ensure he fit into your life and kept you close." Sophie's breath hitched. "So he's always been like this? A genius who sees the market like it's some sort of game?" The doctor's lips curled into a small, understanding smile. "Yes. His cognitive abilities are remarkable. You mention his work as an architect, correct? I believe his brain naturally gravitated toward fields that matched his analytical and creative strengths. But his innate traits, the sharp, straightforward, and slightly eccentric person you're seeing now, are his true self." "I see." Sophie's voice cracked as she tried to process it all. Tears welled in her eyes. "So the Ethan I knew wasn't fake, that he was trying so hard to be someone he thought I'd love." Dr. Wilhelm nodded. "Precisely. Without the memory of that constructed persona, he's simply being himself. It's not uncommon for individuals with his level of intellect to adapt their behavior in such ways, especially if they fear rejection or judgment." Later, as Sophie waited for Ethan to return from the library, her thoughts swirled. She had fallen in love with the considerate, quiet Ethan who had seamlessly blended into her life, who had always been there to support her without complaint. But now, she realized how much effort it must have taken for him to maintain that version of himself. The Ethan sitting across from her at breakfast these days, playful, blunt, and sometimes maddeningly curious, was unfamiliar yet oddly endearing. When Ethan finally returned, holding a thick economics textbook, Sophie stood to meet him. "Learn anything interesting?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her. Ethan shrugged, flipping through the pages. "Just some theories. Not as fun as predicting the market, though." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "You look like you've been crying. Is it that bad? Am I dying?" "No, silly. Not like that," Sophie said, wiping her tears with a chuckle. "You're fine." Sophie said quickly, wiping at her face again, "It's just, I didn't get to say sorry. But let's talk about that later, okay?" "Let's go, I'm hungry," Sophie said, pulling Ethan along. Ethan, ever curious, asked about what she said about saying sorry. That Sophie just said it's nothing. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. You're not a great liar, you know. But if you don't want to talk about it, I won't push. Sophie gave him a shaky smile. Thanks, Ethan. For what? For just being you. Ethan blinked at her, confused, but eventually shrugged and returned to his book. As Sophie watched him, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She didn't know what the future held for them. But one thing was clear: this version of Ethan, the one unburdened by the fear of judgment, was someone she was ready to fight for. Chapter 6. Seeds of Love. The evening was quiet. The only sounds in Sophie's spacious living room were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of the pages as Ethan flipped through a book. Sophie sat on one end of the couch, legs tucked beneath her, while Ethan leaned back on the other, his attention absorbed in a market analysis report he'd brought back from Europe. Their trip had been a whirlwind, but it had revealed something that took Sophie by surprise: Ethan's dream destinations, the ones he'd excitedly jotted down for their itinerary, matched the very ones he had once shared with her before the accident. She hadn't prompted him. These places were genuinely his. The realization filled Sophie with a bittersweet feeling. Some things, she thought, were undeniably and intrinsically Ethan, no matter which version of him she was seeing. She decided now was the time to ask the question that had been weighing on her heart since their return. Ethan, she began softly, setting down her tea. He replied, not looking up from the report. Do you love me? Her words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on both of them. Ethan closed the report slowly and leaned back into the couch, his expression thoughtful. I don't know, he admitted after a long pause. His voice was calm, yet honest. I'm not the Ethan you knew, the one you got engaged to. I'm the newly graduated Ethan. Someone who's never been in a serious romantic relationship. Back in college, most people thought I was weird. So I just didn't try. Sophie bit her lip, unsure whether his words were a relief or another heartbreak. She had expected the answer, but hearing it aloud still stung. I see, she murmured. A silence fell between them, heavier this time, until Sophie sighed and leaned against the armrest. You know, I can't help but feel neglected. Ethan looked at her, puzzled. Neglected? I mean... Sophie hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding desperate. I miss how things were before. We shared everything, our lives, our dreams, and yes, even the bedroom. She looked away, a faint blush creeping up her cheeks. Ethan blinked, his brow furrowing. I don't feel right about that. Why not? Sophie asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Well, to me it's not my place, he said plainly. That was. The other guy. The one you knew before. I'm not him. And besides, he scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. I'm still inexperienced. A virgin, really. Sophie stared at him, her emotions a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and longing. You're still you, Ethan, she said firmly. It's still you, just a different chapter of your life. You're not someone else. Ethan shrugged, clearly unconvinced. But before he could argue further, Sophie leaned closer, her determination shining in her eyes. Then let's fix that, she said, her voice teasing but resolute. And don't feel bad, I'm not cheating. It's still you anyway. Ethan froze, clearly flustered. Sophie. She placed a hand on his, her touch warm and steady. I know this isn't easy for you, Ethan. And I know I made mistakes in the past, mistakes I'd give anything to correct. I doubted the depth of your love for me, and I hurt you with that doubt. But I see now, love isn't always about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about taking what you have and nurturing it. Her voice softened. I see the seeds of something growing in you, Ethan. Something real. And I'm determined to care for it this time. Properly. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sophie thought he might pull away, retreat back into the wall he'd built since the accident. But then, he surprised her. All right, he said quietly. But let's take it slow, okay? Sophie smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she nodded. Okay. For the first time in months, a fragile but unmistakable hope began to bloom in her heart. Chapter 7. A New Beginning. The days had passed slowly, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere between Sophie and Ethan. It was subtle at first. Ethan would bring lunch to her office, his shy demeanor softened by the casual routine he had begun to form with her. He'd surprise her with breakfast sometimes, and when her menstrual period arrived, he always appeared with her favorite mint ginger tea and a pint of Yube ice cream, carefully placed on her desk with a gentle, almost hesitant smile. It wasn't much at first, but Sophie recognized the effort. There was a tenderness in the little things he did for her, things that spoke volumes. Slowly, without her needing to coax him, Ethan found himself in her office more and more, spending time with her without hesitation. And though the line of intimacy had yet to be crossed, the closeness between them grew. At night, Sophie would fall asleep with Ethan beside her, her head on his shoulder, or his arm around her waist. It was innocent in many ways. He never tried to pull away when she hugged him, but he was still a little reserved, a little uncertain in showing affection. His shy gestures reminded her of a teenager with his first love awkward, yet sincere. But one night, Sophie felt something stir deep within her. It wasn't just the silence in the room, or the empty space she felt next to her. No, it was the isolation that seemed to weigh heavily on her heart. A part of her wanted something more, even if she didn't know how to ask for it. And then, to her surprise, Ethan broke the silence. You're my girlfriend, right? His voice was quiet but steady, his words careful. Sophie paused, surprised by the directness of the question. Her heart thumped in her chest, and for a moment, she wondered where this was leading. But she nodded slowly. Yes, I am, she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression shifted. His uncertainty was clear, but there was something else, something deeper in his gaze. Without a word, he moved toward her, his hands tentative but deliberate as he pinned her gently to the bed. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. So, this is fine? Ethan asked, his voice a little shaky. Yet something more intense was hiding beneath the surface. His breath quickened as he looked at her, waiting for her approval. Sophie's heart raced. She could feel the air between them thickening, filled with a longing she hadn't realized was there. Yes, it's fine. We don't need to hurry. Not busy tomorrow, she murmured, the words slipping from her lips almost without thought. Her agreement seemed to break something within Ethan, and without another word, he gave in. The Ethan she knew, the patient, gentle version who had always been careful, perhaps even too careful, was gone. In his place was someone more forceful, assertive, but not in a cruel way. There was a desperation in his touch, a hunger that made Sophie's heart race. His grip on her was firm, and though his movements were rougher than before, they were full of intent. Sophie could feel it, the craving, the longing in his touch. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced with the other version of him, the one she thought she knew so well. This Ethan left impressions on her skin, each one a mark of desire, of needing to feel her in a way he hadn't before. The night passed quickly, hours blending into each other as Ethan barely paused to rest. His urgency was palpable, and Sophie felt every second of it. She felt wanted, craved in a way that made her skin tingle, her body responding to him in ways she didn't fully understand. As the light from the morning sun began to creep through the curtains, Ethan only slowed briefly before resuming his tender, almost desperate need to hold on to her. Exhaustion began to take its toll, and as Ethan finally pulled back, he whispered an apology, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the room. Sophie smiled softly, her own weariness lulling her into a deep, satisfying sleep. "It's fine," she murmured, her voice laced with affection. "I had fun." And as sleep finally overtook her, Sophie realized something. This Ethan, though different, was hers in a way she hadn't yet known. She didn't need to have all the answers. She only needed to be present, to trust in what was slowly but surely growing between them. In this new version of Ethan, she found something raw, something real. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she was finally experiencing love on her own terms. Chapter 8. Old Flames. The day was moving at a dizzying pace, as Sophie's schedule was packed with back-to-back meetings and decisions to be made. She barely had time to breathe, let alone eat. Her mind raced with thoughts of upcoming projects, strategies, and the plans her grandfather Victor had put into motion. So when she realized she had skipped breakfast, Sophie groaned internally, hoping the day wouldn't get worse. Her phone buzzed, and as she read the message, a familiar name popped up. Brad. The blast from the past was unexpected, and she immediately frowned. Victor had insisted on a meeting with him. The old friends of the family had been reconnected after years of estrangement, and Victor, ever the opportunist, thought it would be beneficial for Sophie to hear Brad out. Sophie had never liked the idea of working with Brad, especially not after their painful breakup, but Victor had a way of making things difficult to refuse. Sophie had told herself she would not entertain the meeting, that she'd keep things professional and unemotional. Brad was not someone she wanted to revisit in her life. But as always, Victor had insisted, and here she was, sitting in her office, preparing for an unpleasant conversation. Brad, tall and handsome as ever, was waiting for her in the conference room, a business proposal in hand. His dark eyes swept over her with the same calculating look from the past, as if nothing had changed. The years hadn't softened him. The memory of their tumultuous relationship, the constant pressure he put on her to be something she wasn't ready for, the betrayal she had caught him in was still raw. Sophie opened the door, steeling herself. As expected, Brad immediately launched into his pitch, bragging about his new startup, the talented people he had gathered, and the incredible potential they had if they could secure more funding. It was the same empty talk she had heard 100 times before. "Sophie," he said, leaning forward, his smirk as insufferable as ever. "I know we had our differences, but look at what I've built. With your help, we can really make it something special. I know you're busy, but I think we both know I can help you take your empire to the next level. All I need is your investment." Sophie kept her face neutral, refusing to entertain the bitterness creeping in. Brad had always been about power. He used their relationship to control and manipulate, and Sophie had been blind to it for far too long. When she found him cheating on her with another woman, it had been the final straw. She cut him out of her life, and she never looked back. But that didn't make moments like this any easier. Just as Sophie was about to speak, there was a knock on the door, and it opened before she could respond. "Ethan," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice as she saw him standing in the doorway, holding a tray of food. He always seemed to know when she needed him. Ethan's eyes flickered to Brad for just a moment, but he didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he simply stepped forward, a warm smile on his face as he set the food down on the desk. "I brought you breakfast and lunch too," I noticed you didn't eat. Sophie's heart softened at his gesture. She had become accustomed to Ethan's thoughtful acts, his quiet care that never felt forced or manipulative. She nodded her thanks, her eyes meeting his briefly before turning back to Brad. Brad, clearly annoyed, stood up, taking a step forward. He waved a dismissive hand toward Ethan. I'm sure that's very sweet, but we're in the middle of something here. But Ethan, unfazed, reached over to the desk, picked up the business proposal Brad had left in front of Sophie, and glanced through it. This one's redundant. You already have the names here, Ethan said, his voice calm but confident. By the way, they left last year, and I contacted them. Funding this bleeding venture is just pointless. Ethan placed the proposal back on the desk, his expression unreadable. With one last glance at Sophie, he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Sophie's mind was buzzing with everything Ethan had said. She hadn't expected him to intervene, but she couldn't deny how much his words resonated. Brad's proposal was weak, a desperate attempt to claw back into the business world by exploiting Sophie's family connections. It was the same story, recycled and hollow. As the door closed, Sophie took a deep breath, a sense of satisfaction washing over her. She felt free from the weight of Brad's expectations, free from his influence. Brad, Sophie said, her voice cool and professional, I won't be funding your project. It's redundant and, frankly, a waste of time. My focus is elsewhere, and you should consider moving on. Brad's face twisted with frustration. You can't be serious. Your grandfather will hear about this. You know that, right? Sophie stood tall, her resolve unwavering. Let him. I'll speak to him personally if I have to. But this is my decision. I won't be investing in your venture. As Brad stormed out, Sophie couldn't help but feel a small victory. She wasn't the same person she had been when she dated him. The naivety, the doubt, the hesitations, they were gone. She knew her worth now. And she wasn't afraid to stand her ground, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of her past. And as she sat back in her chair, the lingering tension dissipating, Sophie couldn't help but think of Ethan, how he had seen through Brad's scheme without hesitation, how he cared for her in ways no one else had. Ethan is her ally, and that was worth more than anything Brad and his family could offer.